A second chance for change. Ahead of Barack Obama's inauguration, we look at what to expect from his second term. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. 4 years ago, hundreds of thousands filled the streets of a chilly Washington to witness Barack Obama's inauguration as President of the United States. And 4 years on, he's about to begin his second term following the comfortable defeat of the Republican candidate Mitt Romney. Progressives are hoping the president will be liberated by not being able to run for another term. Many were encouraged by his challenge to the powerful gun lobbies this week. Perhaps it was a sign that at last Mr. Obama will actually take on Washington's vested interests. The president has also made encouraging noises on immigration reform and climate change. Then there's foreign policy, where presidential power is less hamstrung by Congress. France's intervention in Mali, the continuing diplomatic standoff with Iran, and the future of the US's covert global wars are just a few issues that will be closely watched. So, to discuss the challenges facing the president on the domestic front, we're joined by John Nichols, Washington correspondent for The Nation, and Simon Rosenberg, president and founder of the New Democrat Network. John, first of all, that point, though, I wonder if once and for all we should dispel the notion, should we dispel the notion that Barack Obama was some sort of frustrated progressive who now has his wings free to actually be the great progressive president?
Let's dispel that immediately. This is the important thing to remember about Barack Obama, and I think it's a mistake progressives often make. We assume that if somebody has read the same books that we've read, that they must agree with us. The fact is, Barack Obama has certainly sojourned on the left. He has read the Howard Zinn, he's read the literature of the left.
The people's history of the U.S.
People's history of the United States. He's met many, many great progressive players, and he's taken some very progressive stands. But I think the truth of Barack Obama is that he is a mediator president. He is a president who likes to see where the left is, where the right is, and find some place to bring it together. That's something America's liked a lot in history, Dwight Eisenhower and some other folks. But the presumption that he is going to go out personally and raise the banner and march forward as a Franklin Roosevelt did, I think you can be a little careful with that.
Now the problem, and we're going to go through some specific policy areas in a moment, but in that broad discussion, Simon, when you're a mediator president and the right wing has moved so far to the right, what does the middle actually mean anymore? What are you actually, who are you mediating with? Aren't you in danger of then simply being a center-right president? You don't really, if you have no real fundamental principles, progressive principles.
I think the president is a wiser and more experienced president than he was in the first term. I think I'm not sure that in his political career he'd ever really faced a Republican Party like what he faced here in Washington. I think he thought in the first term that reasonable people could sit down and come to a deal. I don't think he believes that anymore. And I think you can see, look, he's only the seventh president in American history who's been elected with more than 50% of the vote twice. And in our system, the consent of the governed really matters. And he has as much consent as only 7 or 8 other figures in all of American history. I think he feels that. You can see it in his voice and his actions, the boldness of the gun plan this week. And I think you're going to see a better, stronger, and bolder second term than we saw in the first term.
Well, let's look at whether then there will be continuity or whether there'll be some radical shifts. It was interesting then, the economy, clearly, the major issue. Jack Lew, nominated as Treasury Secretary. We have a bit more information about Jack Lew, but clearly this is going to be a pivotal figure. He grew up in New York City, attended Harvard, got a law degree at Georgetown. He worked for Democratic House Speaker Thomas Tip O'Neill, continued government work during the Clinton years. He then moved to the private sector, notably to Citigroup from 2006 to 2009. He ran their alternative investments unit, investing in a hedge fund that bet on the housing market collapse. That was a wise bet, actually, as it turns out, but rather controversial. But the unit did incur losses that contributed to Citigroup's need for a taxpayer bailout. He's been a consistent champion of financial deregulation. During confirmation hearings in 2010, he was asked whether deregulation contributed to the U.S. financial crisis, and he said, "I don't personally know the extent to which deregulation drove it, but I don't think deregulation was the proximate cause." He's been serving as White House Chief of Staff since the beginning of 2012. Now, as we look at the economy, John Nichols, what does this potential appointment tell us?
Well, it certainly doesn't tell us there's going to be a big change in direction. Look, Barack Obama is choosing from the circle of people who he governed with. And in this case, Jack Lew is in the center of it. Now, Jack Lew is an incredibly complicated figure. And this is where it gets complex. The Republicans hate him, despise him, because he's really smart and he's good at what he does. And also because he certainly has some commitment to, for lack of a better term, a social welfare state, to,
right.
To keeping Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. By the same token, progressive Democrats have a great big problem with him, very, very uncomfortable with him, because he was there when you got rid of the Glass-Steagall laws, which protected against a lot of this kind of mega bank casino capitalism. He has been a big proponent of free trade, which a lot of progressives have a problem with, and this deregulation stuff.
I guess there was a time when you could be right-wing on the economy but still believe in a social safety net.
Well, that's it. And so I think you have to be careful with Jack Lew. You can't say, oh, he's some right-winger. He's not.
Right.
By the same token, on some of these core economic issues, if you talk to a Senator Bernie Sanders, for instance, he is passionately opposed to Jack Lew's nomination because he thinks Jack Lew will continue to err on the side of Wall Street rather than Main Street.
And that's the point then, Simon Rosenberg, as we go into various negotiations with Congress on the debt and deficit and things like that. The criticism of President Obama in the first term was he accepted the right-wing parameters of the discussion, that something had to be done about Social Security or the social safety net, or that it was the poor who had to pay in order to help with the deficit and so forth in an era of huge corporate welfare and so forth. That's not going to change then. And is there going to be a war on poverty? Or
no, but I think it has changed. I think that it's unfair. I think that's an unfair characterization of what happened in the first term. I mean, first of all, healthcare reform, if it's enacted the way that it's conceived, will be one of the most progressive acts by an American president in the last 100 years of American life. I mean, the impact that's going to have on the working poor in the United States is going to be extraordinary, and it's all going to happen in the next couple of years. Second is that, look what we just fought over in the fiscal cliff. It was about raising taxes on wealthy people and protecting the middle class and the poor.
But while giving away on even, say, costing the benefits for poor people in Social Security.
Look, I think that whether it's accepting the Republican frame or accepting the reality that we need to figure out how to both invest in the things that create long-term growth, right? Infrastructure, long-term R&D, education, skills, knowledge, all those things, while also bringing the deficit into a more reasonable place. We did this in the 90s. We know how to do this. Democrats know how to do this. The Republicans don't. I mean, I reject this notion. So I think the point is that I think we can do both.
But the question is the right priority. Is the priority the deficit or jobs?
No, let me just say, I think the priority, and I think you're going to hear this on Monday, the priority is growth and making sure that we have a stable foundation for a very different economy of the 21st century that we've been unable to do over the last 20 years. I think they're very focused on this based on the meetings and discussions I've had, and I think you're going to hear both. It's not an either or. You can do both.
It's interesting, though, that Simon mentions healthcare reform. That was an issue, though, again, where it was argued that President Obama didn't really challenge the parameters of the debate by pushing for a system which didn't have the profit motive and didn't have private insurance companies. But we are seeing now with guns, the president using the bully pulpit against a very powerful lobby, the NRA and so forth. It's interesting there that you can, and then he does believe that the bully pulpit can be used against powerful vested interests.
Oh, there's no doubt.
Even though we were told he couldn't before.
Well, there's no doubt that he believes in using the bully pulpit and that he's quite good at it.
Yeah.
But here's an important thing to understand. If you look at the NRA realistically, it's not as powerful. It's not as powerful as Wall Street.
Right.
I mean, with all due respect, you're going to take on a vested interest. Say, I'm going to take on a group that is led by Wayne LaPierre, who has proven since the Newtown tragedy, the horror, to be one of the most bumbling public spokesmen for an organization I've ever seen. That's a lot easier than taking on the biggest banks in the country. And so I think that we should be impressed and excited that we have a president who is willing to take, to take a fight and to do this. And I think he's doing it in a bolder way than I might have expected. By the same token, I don't think we should necessarily presume that he's going to keep doing that. And I do think we should be a little cautious. The Barack Obama coalition is a remarkable coalition. It's an epic American coalition. As Simon well pointed out, he is only the second Democrat since Franklin Roosevelt to be elected with more than a majority, and only the second president since Dwight Eisenhower to be elected with more than 51% twice. And so this guy's got a coalition there. But that coalition includes white working class trade unionists who go hunting on the weekend. It also includes key sheeting folks.
So how far can he go on guns, do you think?
Well, where I think he's gone to where he's going to go. We know his agenda. The question is, how much energy does he expend on that, and does that become such a focus that you begin to fray the economic side?
Right.
This is I don't relish the task he's taken on.
Side?
What?
What do you mean by that?
The fact is, he needs those white working class men and women. He needs, and frankly, let me put it this way, I think don't even think about the white working class. Think about working class folks in general who are still hurting in this country. We have high unemployment. If there is a sense that this president is intensely focused on guns and perhaps some social issues, but not as much on the economy, that won't cause those people to vote Republican. But you could end up with a 1994 scenario, where they just don't get excited to come out and vote again.
Right. You mean midterm elections?
Midterm elections.
We're running out of time already, unfortunately. Immigration. You've been doing a lot of work on that, I know, Simon. What are we expecting now?
I think there is going to be a major effort by the president that I think will be perhaps equal in force and weight to what he's rolled out on guns to come out in the next couple weeks. I think we'll hear about it in the inaugural and then in the State of the Union. There's a new poll out today, again, showing overwhelming American support for the solution that the president has offered. We've got a lot of work to do in the Congress, and I think, like on a lot of other issues, the question is, how far a journey can the Republicans travel from where they were to where we want them to be?
But there's a recognition they have to. Right?
Well, but on everything, right? I mean,
they recognize it.
And they recognize it, but also the other thing, just to build on something John said, is that the other thing that's different now is the Republican Party is much weaker today than it was 4 years ago. This was a devastating loss. They've been ideologically defeated, not just politically defeated. Look at this. If you look at what they're saying right now, they don't have a single agenda item right now that would fix a problem in the United States or polls above 30%, right? Their leaders that they're offering in Washington are historically very weak and unpopular. The president not only is stronger, his opposition is weaker. And so I think that's why he feels that. And I think that's why on things like guns and immigration, the economy, we'll see what happens with the budget in the next few weeks. I think he's gonna push as hard as he can.
Very briefly, John Nichols, because we have to mention it. 30 seconds, the environment.
Yeah.
Keystone XL coming up.
Absolutely.
EPA, the former environmental chief, has walked out, ostensibly partly because President Obama is going to approve it. What does this say about his commitment to preventing the destruction of the planet? Frankly?
Well, but you see, this gets to that coalition stuff we're talking about. You have, frankly, some unions that would really like to build that pipeline and work on it. You've got an awful lot of folks who are part of that coalition who are very, very uncomfortable with it. I think this is one of those cases where when you've built this broad coalition, now Barack Obama has to do a great educational challenge wherever he goes on this
to lead
people there. I sure hope he believes that that global warming has got to be addressed.
Is there time for 2 seconds? Is that there's also the competing priority of energy independence and liberating the United States from importing foreign oil, which has not been exactly a great experience for us over the last generation. So I think there are cross pressures here that will be negotiated.
Keystone's not going to contribute, I think, to energy.
Let me just say one simple thing. This is the tough one.
Right.
Yeah.
This is the one he's going to have to sort through. And there's no one, you don't keep the whole coalition together.
Right, it's the fault line. Okay. John Nichols, Simon Rosenberg,
sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now to discuss the president's foreign policy agenda, we're joined by Mark Perry, author of many books, including Talking to Terrorists. Also here, Steve Clemons, editor-at-large for The Atlantic. Steve, as far as domestic policy is concerned, we were just hearing that there is a sense that there may be a more boldness in the administration. Are we expecting any changes, any significant changes as far as foreign policy is concerned?
Well, I think if you were to measure it by presidential posture, his appointments of people like John Kerry, Chuck Hagel, moving John Brennan over to CIA, maybe making Dennis McDonough his chief of staff, this is a president who stopped pursuing necessarily people he's uncomfortable with, a kind of team of rivals, and he's bringing in people he feels very comfortable with. That's the measure. And that's probably a sign he wants to do things and not spend so much time weighing out every option. So I'm surprised by this, but I think the president is preparing to move the needle on some issues.
All right, we'll go into specifics in a moment, but you mentioned John Brennan. Mark Perry, you have an interesting article, actually on the Al Jazeera website, I have to say, saying it's interesting that his nomination has sort of gone under the radar, his nomination for the head of the CIA. We have a bit more information about him. He went to work for the CIA after he graduated from college. He worked in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia for a time, and then he worked for George W. Bush's CIA director, George Tenet. Brennan left government service for a time, but signed on as a foreign policy and intelligence advisor during Barack Obama's 2008 campaign. After Obama's victory, he was nominated to lead the CIA, but he had to withdraw when opponents questioned his support of torture and extraordinary rendition under the Bush administration. In 2007, he justified some aspects of the U.S. torture program, saying, quote, "A lot of information has come out from these interrogation procedures that the agency has in fact used against the real hardcore terrorists. It has saved lives," end quote. During President Obama's first term, he was the administration's chief counterterrorism advisor. The New York Times called him the architect of the expansion of the U.S. drone program, and it was under his leadership that the convention of counting all military-aged males in a strike zone as combatants was instituted, significantly skewing how the U.S. tracks civilian casualties. Mark Perry, if President Obama is comfortable with John Brennan as the head of the CIA, what does that say about the second term?
They're very close. John Brennan is very intelligent. I know it doesn't sound like he's mainstream, but he is. And he is personally uncomfortable with the drone war, even though he's the man who's prosecuted it, called Mr. Drone, the assassination czar. But we sense in him a deeper thinking. He's fluent in Arabic. He knows the Middle East really well. He's now head of the CIA at the very moment when the Obama administration, I think, in this next term, is going to be pivoting towards Asia. He's going to be the guy left behind to deal with the Middle East.
With drones, extrajudicial killing, signature strikes.
With all of those things that the CIA should not be doing, the military should be doing. I think we're going to see a demilitarization of the CIA, which is long overdue, and the turning over of these programs to the Pentagon.
I mean, many have questioned that, because I mean, that is an interpretation we've seen, Steve. However, John Brennan is also known to be a very political animal. He said things that in the past have been shown to be completely untrue on many occasions. Much of this wishful thinking, perhaps, on what he might do at the CIA, of removing it from the paramilitary business, is based on some of his pronouncements. But how can we believe some of these things?
Well, I think that I respect where Mark is coming from. I think it's a big question mark. And fundamentally, I think one of the reasons why there's not been a lot of reaction to John Brennan is you're really just moving a chair and you're keeping someone that the president trusts, who's been very close. They've been, creating kill lists every morning of the president's tenure, and John Brennan's been in there. But at the same time, Brennan has brought a governance to some issues like rendition and secret prison sites to basically get us out of some of those businesses. He has been opposed to keeping Guantanamo open, even though they haven't found a way to get it closed. In a way, I've kind of compared him to Joseph Kennedy, Ted Kennedy and JFK's dad in the 1920s and 30s, who broke every rule in the book on manipulating markets, became very rich, and then was put in charge of the Securities and Exchange Commission by Roosevelt. And to some degree, John Brennan, who's done all these things, he is Mr. Drone, will probably end up being the guy who codifies and does some of the global deal making on how do we manage gray wars when you're at war with non-state players. And I think that's a possibility, and it may not be how things turn. Of course there's healthy skepticism. We should all be skeptical. But there's no one else positioned well to take that track. And at least that's the track that the White House tells me they're hoping Brennan moves.
In the meantime, we have Chuck Hagel nominated at Defense. We have John Kerry nominated as Secretary of State. There is, again, a dream amongst some that this will mean some huge change in foreign policy, more realist foreign policy. Perhaps Hillary Clinton and Susan Rice and others got a bit bogged down, for example, on Iran and other things. Weren't looking at it in a pragmatic sense. Do you think that might be the case now?
Again, as with Brennan, I'm surprised a little bit by the Hagel nomination. We have a Pentagon that's going to be scaled back in terms of its budget. We're in the middle of a fiscal crisis. That isn't going to change. Here's a man who's not known for balancing the books or for being a fiscal expert, unlike Panetta, who knew how to do that. This man, Chuck Hagel, is a big thinker. He's a very impressive guy. He knows the military well. He's a Vietnam veteran. He understands the costs of war. That's his plus and his positive. But what we're going to be needing in this second term is somebody who's going to look at the nuts and bolts of the Pentagon budget, and he will probably leave that to somebody else.
That's the point, though, isn't it? I mean, as far as, there's been a lot of concentration on his views of Israel and so forth, but at Defense, he doesn't have that much influence over that sort of policy.
He has influence over resources get deployed in the world. He's going to be moving a lot of those resources and attention away from South Asia and the Middle East to Asia. And I think, as Mark just correctly pointed out, Hagel's preoccupation is going to be on big concepts. He's going to have to be the guy, and Leon Panetta could never pull this off. I'm a fan of Leon. He did know the budget numbers, but this guy could never talk about the roles and functions of the military in the future.
He can explain why it's being cut.
He can explain why it's cut, but the implication is we're going to have less security. Chuck Hagel has to look at citizens in the world and say, we're going to transform the military, we're going to get efficient, we're going to create new leverage points, and we're going to come out with as much security deliverables as we had before these cuts. That's what his job is.
Certainly Hillary Clinton and the State Department seem to have a certain amount of leeway from President Obama. Do you think John Kerry then, in the Secretary of State role, will have a certain amount of leeway, which then might mean some difference in attitudes towards Iran and other topics? Steve,
I think John Kerry is going to be introduced to all of the big insoluble problems that the president has, like Israel-Palestine, and be given a lot of latitude to play as much as he wants in that arena, because it's something that the president would like to get a little distance from. So John Kerry's going to, and remember, Chuck Hagel is going to have all the resources.
Right.
John Kerry's going to have to do a new global deal on some of these issues and do some, demonstrate whether he has the ability to throw some interesting statecraft into problems that nobody else has been able to solve.
Let's be specific then, okay? Yeah. So say for on Iran, are we expecting any changes then, Mark?
No, I don't think so. Here's what all three of these gentlemen have in common, Brennan, Hagel, and Kerry. They're all friends of the President of the United States. He's very comfortable with him. They're not likely to stand in the room and bang the table. They're going to agree with him. This is a team not of rivals, but of friends. The truth of the matter is, and this was true in the first administration, I believe, is that Obama is his best foreign policy advisor. He is the guy who holds the day in the quiet meetings. He has a clear vision of what he wants. That was true in the first 4 years of his term.
Does he have a clear vision there? I mean, there's some confusion.
The pivot to Asia is his.
Right, but as far as Iran or the Middle East, there seemed to be a certain amount of confusion.
He would rather push back a little bit from the Middle East, get out of Afghanistan, forget about Iraq, let's not spend too much money, let's not get boots on the ground. Yeah. That's his vision. Let's pivot to Asia.
These are going to be
for
small
trade,
footprint,
economics. That's who he is.
All right, we have the prospect of an even more right-wing political establishment in Israel, for example. What does that mean for the Iran issue then? I mean, and invasions, or Syria for that matter, or all these other things.
Syria, I think he's going to maintain a judicious distance despite the horrors inside. I think it's going to be very hard to come up until somebody really comes up with a plan that, receives both international and regional approval. President Obama won't really move.
Iran, good faith negotiations.
On the Israeli stuff, it makes a bad problem much worse. But in my view, there'll be some truth-telling about this. Most people who pay attention to this said, Israel gets a lot of domestic ground out of its raising the Iran issue. Same thing, Iran is going to have elections, and of course they talk negatively about it. But the real crisis and tension in the region is not between Israel and Iran, it's between the Saudis and Iran. There are other drivers that drive this that are fundamental. No one wants to talk about that, but that's fundamentally the fault line that's driving through all of these issues in the region. And I suspect that under John Kerry, Chuck Hagel, you're going to hear a counter-narrative begin to develop that begins to disabuse people of this notion that we're on an existential edge with Israel and Iran.
As far as the pivot to the Pacific and the rebalancing of forces, what exactly does that mean in real terms? Isn't that simply then just stoking tensions in a different theater now?
The promise of the pivot to Asia is that it's economic focused, that it will open up new areas of trade which this country desperately needs. Militarily, what it means for the Navy and Air Force is that at least the portion of the budget that's left will be going to them instead of the Army. There's a huge fight in the Pentagon right now over this new doctrine called air-sea battle, which seems to leave the Army out. You talk to Army Chief of Staff Ray Odierno, he's very upset about this. We're in for a big budget battle, how the pie is divided. That's going to, I think, take up the next year in the budget talks.
But geopolitically, what does this mean, Steve? I mean, is this simply about provoking China, though?
Well, right now, China is, in a way, its own worst enemy because it has moved from being in a charm offensive with much of the world to things like declaring sovereignty over the whole South China Sea is making many countries in the region run towards us. And we're seeing bizarre things like Japan and the Philippines coordinating on security. Japan and Korea, these are nations that have had cultural and historical problems in dealing with each other in a lot of ways. They're changing. Burma moving, and you see the United States president going to Burma. You see things. So how did that happen? It happened because everyone's scared of China. So yes, it will engage China, and it will be a balance of the cliche that we're going to confront China in some ways and collaborate in others. But right now, they feel like the way to deal with China's rising swagger is by having a very big presence there.
Steve Clemons, Mark Perry, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.